My goodness. And I forgot to get something to drink during class. What are we going to do about that? My last class, I had to have a break to get some water. Can you imagine? All right. So curve, here's my thought. So I was looking over the quiz grades and the average is 80%, which to me is really good. So I'm going to go, I know, you're not going to like this. I'm going to go with no on just the overall curve. However, here's my kind of general thought about quizzes versus weekly questions. If your quiz grades are high and your weekly question grades are low, you know what I think about that. I'm not super excited about that. I know. You're going to say, well, I just don't write that well. You know the question ahead of time. You can look it up in the book. If I'm giving you a low grade, it's not about your writing style. I guarantee you. It's because you're not putting enough stuff in it. So if your weekly questions are really good and your quiz grade is kind of stinky, I'm going to be much more okay with that when it's time to figure your final grade than if your quiz grades are really good and your weekly question grades are really stinky. Also, by Friday, I'll put a couple things up there. I don't know that I've put the here's the stuff to study list for you. And I apologize if I haven't, but I'll double check on that. I know the one person has sent me the message I need to look over a weekly question again. So I'll look at that. What was the other thing I was going to put up? Oh, study for the quiz thing. And, at some point, we're past the middle of the class. I graded a couple of you who turned in 5 or 6 things late over spring break. And no shame. I mean, I told you you could do that. So I'm not getting on to you for that at all. I told you you could. So I get that. However, we're kind of at the point where you can't do that anymore because, my grades will be due a few days after class ends. So you can't turn in 5 things at the end of class. So at this point, we're going to have to start really limiting how late a late assignment is. Now, a day, I've already mentioned to somebody who's like, I'm sick. And a day to me is almost like being on time. And if you've got COVID, it's especially like being on time. However, 2 weeks is not like being on time. So I get it if you're a little bit behind, but you can't always be behind. You got to get caught up. Now's the time. And then I'll make some sort of announcement that suggests a general, after it's this late, the most amount of credit I'm going to give you is this. Okay. Because sometimes, I know sometimes you get behind. Sometimes you just put stuff off because your professor's nice and lets you put stuff off. Because, I understand that. But I'm not trying to discount the difficulty of this time or your life or whatever situation you're facing. However, still got to turn stuff in and I got it. All right. And also, if you're a high school type person, there's probably somebody from your high school that emailed me this week and said, I got to know if the kids are passing or failing. So I'll probably need to send those emails by Friday. Otherwise, those people will be upset with me. All right. Time to talk about history, probably. All right. Let me open something. Oh, that's the wrong button. Let's look at weekly questions. Let's see if I have anything I remember that I want to share with you about weekly questions. Yeah, I think I pretty much graded all the stuff you've turned in, except maybe the one person's one thing I got to go back and look at. And I noticed too, there were a couple of things that I graded again, and for whatever reason, the new grade didn't show up. So I'll go back and kind of double check on that as well. But anyway. The good war thing, you guys pretty much had that down. Although, as I mentioned to you, I really wanted you to talk about stuff that you thought was good plus stuff that you thought was bad. And that really should be more of an expectation in a college class that, nothing's ever one-sided, nothing's ever completely good or completely bad, with the exception of Hitler, who's always completely bad. And don't tell me, but yes, he was a good public speaker. Just no, Hitler, always completely bad. Just trust me on that. Yeah, just trust me. Okay. So when somebody says, was this good? Is it really good? Talk about the good stuff, but also mention contradictory. And I know I told you that. I probably should stop telling you that again. All right. And then, yeah, for our question for this week, By 1952, the Cold War was cast in terms of a worldwide battle between freedom and slavery. Explain how the Cold War had been come to be seen in this way, events that illustrate this view, and the historical consequences of such a view. And I think that last part might be a little harder if you're not big on US history and don't already, know a whole lot about the Cold War. So I'm not going to be, if you're one of those folks, no harm, no shame, no trouble. However, a couple things that I would think about while you're writing this answer. Okay, first of all, pages in the textbook. Pretty much the whole chapter is about this stuff, but I would start with, especially pay attention to the section called the Anti-Communist Crusade. That starts on page 928 and then goes for a long time, for a very long time. I'm really kind of through the end of the chapter. Now, it is going to talk about how the Cold War impacts unions and civil rights and that sort of stuff. So feel free, to add some of that stuff, but don't feel like that has to be everything you talk about because it's already a pretty big question, okay? The next thing I would notice is it says, for whatever reason, 1952. And what I think I would try to figure out is why did whoever choose this question? I go with me because I chose it. I'm not going to lie to you. I got it from the little textbook list of questions, but whoever chose this question, me, why did I pick 1952? So either at some point in the introduction, because it does say by 1952, the Cold War was cast in terms of this, maybe mention why 1952. If you're wondering why 1952, you could talk about, McCarran-Walter Act of 1952 that says we can revoke your citizenship and deport you if you refuse to name names about other people that you knew were communists. So because in 1952, with that law, we decided that you weren't a true American if you weren't willing to explain why or how someone else might have been a communist. So this is going to lead to, we already have that era of McCarthyism that started a little bit before this, but this puts it into law and says that we can kick you out of the country if you don't name names. So that's the main reason the 1952 is the thing. I would also, if I were you, look at the who is an American thing on page 931. So for you to be successful and get all the points you would like to get, 928, and then go through the end of the chapter, which honestly is 930. It's about 10 pages, a little bit longer. 928 to 940. Okay, so it really is kind of the end of the chapter. And be sure to mention, if there's a date in the question, we want to know why that date. Be sure to mention why that date. And also, it's not just the McCarran Act, although that's the main thing that you want to talk about, but also the McCarthy hearing at that point as well. So you may want to mention that. Okay. And I'm always looking for specific information. Yes, specific information, details, not this was bad, this was good, but I want evidence that something was bad or good. Okay, got it? All right. And sorry, I'm looking, I think 52, I remember 52 is when we executed the Rosenbergs as well. 53, but they were sentenced to death. It was either late 51 or early 52 for being spies. So, at that point, not only are we kicking you out of the country, we're also executing you if we think you might be a communist. So that's serious business. What else did I want to say about questions? Oh, dates. Always put dates in questions. So when you say an event happened, just put the date in parentheses. That's my little version of parentheses. It helps you keep track of what you're talking about and when it happened. It'll help you keep track of chronology. And in a history class, we love to keep track of chronology because we think chronology sometimes shows cause and effect. or change over time, which are some of our favorite things to talk about in a history class. Oh, and the other thing, I'm sure I mentioned this to you in comments, when you talk about a person, I'm so sorry, in a history class, then you need to mention them by their last name, with a few exceptions. Like if it's FDR, you can call him FDR. That's cool. Oh goodness, I shouldn't have gone outside. Oh, so sorry. Ah. But yeah, with the exception of like FDR, JFK, that kind of stuff, last name has to be in the mention. You know, you can't call him Franklin, or you can't call him Harry, you know, because you're not their best friend and they're not a character in a novel. So last name. And if you use their title with their last name, if I were you, I'd capitalize it. And also, I've talked to a couple of you about organization in your answers. And I know you're thinking this is not an English class. You know what? Every class is an English class because you're writing in English. So you know, unless it's a Spanish class, and then it's probably not an English class, or you know what I'm saying. Unless it's a language other than English, what my generation would have called foreign language, I know, then it is an English class, and how you write matters. Recognize, well, no, the English class is also necessary because those guys are going to be more concerned about stylistic stuff and literature and that kind of stuff. However, whatever job you have, no matter if you're a math science person or not, you're always going to be writing, even if it's just an email or a memo or a report or something. You want it to sound like you know what you're talking about. In history, sometimes if your writing is ineffective, then it really, no, you really have to have the English composition. I'm never going to argue to get rid of it, I promise, even though I know nobody wants to write 10 papers. But you know, if you write stuff out of order, if you use the wrong verb tense, if you don't write well, it impedes the meaning of what you're trying to say. So that's always going to matter in your classes, but it's also going to matter in your job as well, I promise. All right, enough talk about writing, huh? Let me look at your chat. Yeah, no, you've gotta have the, yeah, you gotta have the English class. I wasn't trying to argue to get rid of it, but I do think you should apply what you learn in the English class to all of your other writing. And also don't answer questions like you're texting. Okay, spell out words, that sort of stuff. Because sometimes old people don't get it, and I'm going to officially classify myself as old. And plus, you know, this is formal writing. I know that I'm not counting off for grammar and spelling and that kind of stuff, but it is formal writing. Yeah. Yes, it does make other languages more confusing. It's funny too. I know we got to get to class here. Sorry. My dad texted me this morning, and my dad, you know, he's an old guy. They're cranky, that sort of thing. He gets distressed when he watches the news and people use, you know, inappropriate verb choices or slang, that kind of stuff. So he texted me something somebody said, and he goes, how do people from other countries even begin to understand what we're saying when we can't speak our own language? And I went, yeah, there you go. Yeah, no doubt. All right, which I think is a nice observation for an old cranky guy. So good job, Dad. All right. So here we go, talking about stuff from the time period. All right. Sorry, I threw my phone because people are texting me. Should I be throwing my phone for that reason? So let me go back just for fun to remind you, oh, darn. I think I just really went over all the stuff that you want to think about for the question. I promise you, if you look at 928, it just spells it out for you. It's super, super, yeah, clear. All right, so cultural Cold War, that's a good place to start. Sorry, that's where we were, wasn't it? Yes, it was. CIA and the we talked about this before we left. Can you imagine the CIA taking care? My brother keeps texting me, so let me check for 1 second. Okay. When your dad's almost 80, you got to check when your brother's text you. He's fine. Everything's good. Sorry. My dad's healthy for 80, but it's 80. You know what I'm saying? Okay. The CIA is supporting the arts. Can you imagine? Do you think the Grammys would have been different if the CIA supported them instead of whatever those ladies were doing in their dance? There'd be people in their uniforms shooting at people, maybe. But there was that a couple years back. There was some guy that shot somebody in a video. I remember that because somebody at a local middle school showed that in their class. That's a really fast way to get yourself fired if you're a middle school teacher. That's exactly what happened to that person, by the way. But this was a push for us to spread our culture globally because we want everybody to understand how much cooler we are than everyone else. And the best way to do that is to share your music. Indeed, it is. Certainly not to share your US history class, but your music, yes. Okay, and your art and your movies and all the cool stuff. And I think we still do a pretty good job of that. And I don't think it's through, I know it's not through the CIA. It's through the corporations that make quite a bit of money doing that because, you know, money, we like it. All right. Our goal, of course, is spreading freedom, which we also are equating with money during this time period. And even though that sounds crass, you know that there's truth to it. Don't you know that there's truth to it? Are you going to argue with me? Oh, somebody's in the chat already arguing with me. Let me look. Uh-oh. Am I freezing? Maybe it's because it's cold in my house. Yeah, that's what it is. That's it exactly. No, we do equate freedom with money. Yeah, I was funny. Because to be free, you have to have money. I mean, that's just the truth. I had a colleague one time who argued that, yeah, sorry about your Wi-Fi. But see, some of that's money. You're not free. No, I have no idea if it's money. It probably is your neighborhood. I know my neighborhood's kind of like a little Wi-Fi deficit. So every once in a while, I can't get online either, which is extremely uncool. And I live in a fancy town, Leander. I mean, it's super fancy out here. So I don't know why that doesn't work. But economics limit everything. They do. I mean, if you're, and we've talked about this related to education, of course, because of what you guys are talking about right now in the chat. If you live in a zone where there's not good Wi-Fi, your ability to do your work online isn't going to be as strong. If you're, the school district I used to work for supplies computers to everybody. If your district doesn't do that, then you may have a super old computer. Like my computer's 10 years old, not this one, because somebody felt sorry for me and gave me a newer computer. It's interesting to have friends like that, isn't it? But you know, if you don't have money, you also are not going to be as involved in politics. And you're thinking like, why in the world, you know, does that limit you? It's because you're busy working. People who don't have to work every day or maybe own a company and can pass that company's leadership off to someone else while they run for office, those guys are going to get to control policy. If you're poor, you don't get to control policy. Sometimes it's even hard for you to find time to vote. You know what I'm saying? So money does help determine your freedom to a certain extent. And I don't know, I know because some of you have talked about it, you've been to other countries or maybe even other parts of this country that aren't quite as, you know, super fancy and affluent as, say, Central Texas, like the part I grew up in, the Ozarks, where my old dad grew up in a house with a dirt floor and no running water. His freedom was different than, say, my mom's freedom, whose family was much more affluent. So she had better educational opportunities. But I was saying I had a friend, colleague who said, you know, I don't understand parents because they understand that the best thing they can do for their kids, culturally, educationally, is to travel. And I went, it's called poverty. You don't go on a vacation to France if you're not sure where dinner's coming from. So, all right, I'm off that thing. Okay. But we wanted to show the rest of the world that we have this ability to be affluent, and that ability to be affluent is going to lead to freedom. And in a lot of ways, it's really hard to argue that. I know it seems really crass and materialistic and capitalism's the devil, or maybe it's not. It is Texas, so I know you probably don't feel that way. And you're going to college, and you're not just, no offense at all, but you're not just taking a college class because you think being better educated makes for a better society. You guys want a job. I know you do. And none of you want to be history teachers. What the heck's wrong with you? Because you can earn bank teaching history. You could live in Leander like me. You know what I'm saying? But we think that education is a path to more economic success. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, good luck on the sleeping and earning money. All right, push for human rights. You do start to see that in the United Nations with Eleanor Roosevelt on the U.S. as the U.S. representative on the committee that writes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which asserts that everyone in the world deserves certain things and not to be discriminated against, sort of along the lines of the four freedoms, but a little bit stronger. There is a discussion about putting in a non-discrimination clause in there, and the US says we're not quite ready for that. So we pushed back against that. Yeah. All right. Oh, that's true. Sometimes you don't get paid on lunch break if you have to clock out. Yeah, for sure. All right. So no planned enforcement for the UN Declaration of Human Rights, but it is going to set a standard that we'll start to judge each other on, and then we'll use that for political purposes as well. So the Soviet Union will talk about how the racial issues in the United States mean that we're in violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then we'll assert that when Stalin kills people who disagree with him, that might also be a violation of human rights. Now, both of them honestly are. And the discrimination during this time period is going to go beyond this, just the segregation that you're aware of. I know that you've probably heard discussion, if you watch the news, about why African Americans are less likely to take, say, a COVID vaccine than maybe the general public. And you may, I don't know if you notice stuff like this, but the very first person in the United States to get a COVID vaccine was a nurse. I think she was an ER nurse, and she was an African American woman. When Kamala Harris was running for vice president, she said there was no way she would take any Trump vaccine. But once she became the vice president, she did get vaccinated very publicly. There's a reason that I mean, those things are definitely not an accident because of the Tuskegee experiment, which there's on the book list. You could read, it's called Bad Blood. It's incredibly depressing, but it happens around this time period that we're talking about. They wanted to study the development of untreated syphilis during a time period when we knew how to treat syphilis. And if you have syphilis and you don't treat it, we don't often say STD names that often in a history class, in case you're wondering. But if you have this and it's untreated, you'll die. I mean, you will. If you treat it with penicillin, I don't know that cured is the right word, but you lose the effects of this. So, studying the progression of a disease when you have the cure for the disease or an effective treatment seems unethical. Then added to a very poor community of exclusively African American men in a very poor area of Tuskegee, Alabama, and you use the US government, you use an institution, a university, and you use medical professionals to do it, and you do this for over 20 years, you are going to lead to a lot of distrust in certain communities during this time period. Yeah, if you're allergic to penicillin, that's not going to help you. But don't miss my big point here, but I get what you're saying. So, goodness. So during this time period, also if you're in jail, they might sterilize you. If you're in a mental health institution, they might sterilize you. If you're in the military, they're going to test you to see what happens to you if you're exposed to nuclear fallout. So this is not really an era where they're very concerned about your individual rights. So the civil rights movement, which you're going to, I think on the surface looks like it really just benefits people of color, which is good. Please don't misinterpret what I'm trying to say that in that way. It's going to be expanded to so many different groups that the impact of the civil rights movement continues even to this day, I think. So it's not just about the obvious segregation. It's about all kinds of stuff that happens under the surface, that happens to soldiers, that happens to people in mental institutions, it happens to people in prisons, it happens to people of all colors, ethnicities, happens to people who are gay, happens to people who are female. So there's, yeah, the civil rights movement, it's really big. All right, back to business. Sorry, I get excited about this stuff. I'm sorry, and then I sort of lose track. All right, back to business. United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's the beginning of something that really matters, even though I know it's not terribly effective at first. And I also know that there are issues with the UN, that people kind of pick teams at the UN, and that human rights violations matter more in certain countries than they do in other, depending on if that country is your ally, or if you owe money to that country, or if that country has a good military and you're worried they might, harm you in some way. So I know that politics and the UN go together. However, it's a start. All right. And it may lead to some changes in individual countries, and it's going to lead to some fairly important humanitarian actions in lots of countries that normally would not receive humanitarian actions. Now, I also understand that those are probably not selfless. However, whether you got the water because somebody wanted to look good or because they were being selfless, either way, you got the water. You know what I'm saying? All right. Truman. Harry Truman. Dang, what a weird dude. And the book is going to talk more specifically about Harry Truman than I'm going to. Because, but Harry Truman was picked as vice president in term number 4 for that guy, FDR, because he's from a state that segregates. And you go like, why the heck would you pick somebody on purpose from a state that likes segregation? Because FDR is liberal enough, so he's going to get all the big city and the liberal votes. The Democrats wanted to get somebody in there who was going to get the small town rural votes or the southern votes. And they had to pick a guy that they think maybe would appeal to that group of people. So Truman seemed like their guy because he's from a state that values and practices segregation, my home state, of Missouri. And he also had been supported by a political machine, so he might appeal to people that were used to machine politics and making sure things are done the right way, the way they've always been done, that sort of thing. So Truman looks like a really Southern friendly kind of guy. So then Truman becomes president, and he's not a very Southern friendly kind of guy. He thinks segregation's wrong, more so than probably anybody who had been president for a long time. So what he is going to do is desegregate the military by executive order. He's going to do what? He's going to give an executive order where he says, you know what, military is desegregated, we're done with that. His thought is if he does that, which he has the power to do, then the rest of society might follow. And he figures the military is a good place to do that because whether they like it or not, they did not. The head of the military was Dwight Eisenhower, and he spoke out against desegregating the military because he thought it would cause disruption and ruin the order and routine, that kind of stuff. Because, if you're an old white guy, probably order and routine in the military that's segregated seems fine to you. If you're, not a white guy, it may not seem as fine. Or just a guy like Harry Truman, who had served in the military, who thinks that segregation's unfair because, well, it is. Maybe it's time to fix it because we don't have to keep something the same way just because it's wrong. So Truman says, okay, we're getting rid of segregation in the military over the objections of the leaders of the military. But they'll do it because they do it. That's what they have to do. They follow orders in the military. So, and it's It's a pretty big success. Now, Truman considered other executive orders, but if you, by executive order, do too many things or too broad of a thing, it doesn't mean that it's going to be accepted or carried out. So he establishes a commission called, a commission, and they produce a report called To Secure These Rights, which recommends a couple of things. One, desegregate every public thing, every public thing. So schools, public institutions, uh, government institutions, transportation, anything that's public, desegregated. That does not excite the South. They do not go like, go Team Democrat. Instead, and white guys in the South had voted for Democrats forever, really, since Andrew Jackson. So, I mean, that's a long time ago. That's 18 something, 28, 29 when he takes office. So Southerners really like Democrats, but after Harry Truman says this, the South says, we don't know that we like the Democrats anymore. So when Harry Truman runs for president in 40, 48, 50, when does he run for president? 48, yeah. The Southern Democrats are like, nope, we do not want Harry Truman because he wants to desegregate everything and he wants to extend the New Deal into the modern era and call it the Fair Deal to help end post-war poverty. Because dang, we got a lot of money, so we might as well use it to end poverty. And people in the South who are statistically much more poor than people in the North are like, no, we'll pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, even though if they have boots, they may not have straps. But the Southerners say, we're going to run our own dude. So they run a dude named Strom Thurmond for president. Strom Thurmond. Do you guys know anything about Strom Thurmond? This is where you have to answer. Yes, no, or maybe. I'm ready for answers. Let's see. No, I got to know. Has anybody else ever heard of Strom Thurmond? Okay, good. That means that I know something you don't. I worry sometimes that you guys think I don't know anything. Dang kids. Okay, so Strom Thurmond. Part of the reason I know Strom Thurmond, we didn't hang out or anything, but 100 years ago when I went to college to earn some degree so I could teach this class, it's not really why I got the degree, but what a huge bonus for me it's been. I earned this fellowship where I could go to Georgetown University. Perhaps you've heard of it. They used to be really good at basketball, but it's a fairly nice institution of higher learning. And I got to go there for summer school. And then we got to have like little special trips where we went to we didn't go to the White House, but we went to the Congress. We met some senators, we met some Supreme Court justices. And one of our trips, we were there for like 5 weeks because you got to go for 5 weeks for summer school. So one of our trips, Strom Thurmond, nearly 100 years old. Dang, that man lived forever. He was still in Congress. So he was in Congress in 48 and he was in Congress in, I think my trip there was 99. So a really long time. He's still in Congress during that time period. It's like, dang, that man is still alive. Strom Thurmond ran for president in 1948. He's also still from South Carolina and still probably a racist dude. He'd also been a KKK member and his family was pretty wealthy. Now, ironically enough, during this time period when Strom Thurmond was saying, you know what, if you elect me for president, we will have segregation now and segregation forever. So that's his platform. He's running on, I will never get rid of segregation. And he wins 5 states, not votes in 5 states, but 5 actual states. I got to stop hitting the computer and screaming at you. And if you're worried, no, Texas was not one of them. Let me see if I can remember. It's always Arkansas. I don't know what's up with Arkansas. Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. I know you're shocked by those 5 states voting for a guy that wants segregation forever. But while he's running for president, while he's saying segregation now, segregation forever, as a Dixiecrat, a Southern Democrat, he is also, yes, having an affair with a Black woman that produces a child. So he ends up with a Black daughter. I'm just saying. Now, if you're a Black woman, what do you do if Strom Thurmond is your dad? I mean, that's a huge problem because he's like the most outspoken racist of his era, and he's your dad. That's really weird. So mom and the daughter end up moving to California, where Strom Thurmond regularly sends money, supports them. I'm not arguing that he's a good dad. Believe me, I'm not. Pays for expenses. The girl goes to college, that kind of stuff. And then when Strom Thurmond dies, there's this weird press conference in, I think it's in Los Angeles. And there's these reporters at this lady's house, and she comes out to the porch and she says, yes, Strom Thurmond was my father, and no, I'm not going to talk about it. And that's all you hear. Really weird stuff. But anyway, Strom Thurmond, dang, that's a weird dude. Other fun fact about Strom Thurmond, at first he's a Democrat, later on he'll be a Republican. So he switches parties. And that happens late 60s, early 70s. All right, anyway, Strom Thurmond runs for president, and then is just a senator forever. I think until he's 100, to be honest. Truman issues an executive order, desegregates the military, loyalty systems and their impact on civil rights. And this is going to help you with your question, perhaps, about stuff. Let me check the chat. I'm sorry, I ignored the chat. Yeah, Strom Thurmond definitely lost. That's the one where Truman wins, probably because of his reaction to the Berlin airlift. Probably, yeah. Strom Thurmond. See, now you could read a book about Strom Thurmond. You would learn a lot of weird stuff. But I don't know. I want to read a whole book. That's unusual, dude. But anyway, I'd spend my time reading more about Truman or maybe Strom Thurmond's daughter. That'd be more interesting. I'm pretty sure she didn't want a book. All right. I didn't mention when Truman said he wanted to extend the fair deal, he wanted universal health insurance and public works jobs. So he's talking Affordable Care Act in the 1940s, right after World War II. Part of the reason that he wants to do this is we have money. And this is the era, 40s and 50s, where we would really, really like to end poverty because we have the money to do it. Okay, the person whose name, are we talking Strom Thurmond? I'll type it in there. Without capitalizing stuff, because I know I just gave you the whole lecture about capitalizing stuff. I'm the worst typist, but I always do that spelling and grammar check because I'm terrible at typing. All right, loyalty systems and their impact on civil rights. And any of these things, especially this stuff, the McCarran Act right there, this thing, more obvious. The McCarran Act has to come up in your answer. It does, but any of this stuff could come up in your answer. And again, 926 to the end of the chapter. Let me put that in the chat as well. Sometimes I worry you kids are not paying attention. Why do I worry about that? Dang it, the chat went away. Why did the chat go away? That's not it. Oh, I made the whole list of stuff go away. I'll wait till the chat comes back up. Dang it. Why do I keep doing that? Do you guys have any idea? Poop. I'm just going to put it in the chat while I can find the chat. It was 926. Goodness. All right, back to the sharing the screen. I somehow, well, I'll explain to you how I looked at somebody else's assignment, some other professor. When you guys turn in your stuff, you know that it goes through plagiarism check. I assume that you know that. And then if you have somehow copied something that another student has turned in, not only does it tell me, that it was one of my students, it tells me anybody who uses Blackboard. So one of you turned in something that was pretty similar to something in somebody else's class. So I thought, well, I'm going to look at their assignment, which was substantially longer. And it made me think, as much as sometimes my students whine about how much work I give them, there's at least one professor out there, it looks like they're given about 5 times as much. Can you imagine? Seems like a lot to me. But at any rate, one of you, I don't want to say that you plagiarized them. I don't think you did. It's just your writing was pretty similar because their question was similar. And, if it says that you plagiarized it, yeah, it's always good for you to, I don't leave the plagiarism check tool that's in the program live uh, because I don't want you to freak out, to be honest, because all of you will show up with some level of plagiarism because I'm not asking you mysterious questions. Was World War II good or bad? Yeah, I'm certainly not the first person to ask that or to ask about the limit of free speech and human rights because of the Cold War. I'm certainly not the first person to ask about that. Or even if you just repeat the question in there, it's going to show up as plagiarized. Yeah. So I don't know how you know if the tool is honest or not, but I do know that when it tells me that your plagiarism is 100%, yeah, that's a problem. And it also will give me the source. So anyway, um, and there are certain things I would know that you plagiarized anyway, as you can tell. All right, loyalty systems impact that kind of thing. So House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, force people to name names. So House, when they say House, it's House of Representatives. And the head of this committee was a fellow named um, Richard Nixon for a while. It's going to help him rise to prominence. And he is going to help convict, why could I not think of the word, a fellow named Alger Hiss, who's going to be a State Department employee, and he's going to be accused of being a spy by a guy named Whittaker Chambers, who also was on a spy tour, a spy speaking tour with a woman named Elizabeth Bentley, who I guess for the era was considered fairly attractive, and they called her the Red Spy Queen. So both Bentley and Whittaker Chambers were double agents. So they told the Russians they were spying for them, but they were actually spying for the United States. They could have been lying and spying for both. I don't know. I'm not in charge of that. But because the evil godless communists were so trendy during this time period when their espionage careers were over, they went on speaking tours and talked about their episodes as spies and that sort of stuff. So Whittaker Chambers said, we have a lot of spies in our own State Department, which is going to lead to some McCarthy kind of stuff. And so he reports this to the House Un-American Activities Committee and testifies in front of them, either because he's a very loyal American or he wants to make more money, or both. Up to you. And so he says, I know this guy Alger Hiss he's a communist. So then they bring Alger Hiss in front of the committee. It's like, I don't even know Whittaker Chambers. I don't know who he thinks he is, talking about me like that. He's just making crap up. That's exactly what he said. He's making crap up. So then Whittaker Chambers says, I can prove that Alger Hiss knows me. And so he gets a whole bunch of newspaper reporters and other journalists to come with him. So they document this. So he goes out into a pumpkin patch. Yes, I said a pumpkin patch in Maryland. Don't you wish you lived in the 50s? Stupid stuff going on. So he goes to a pumpkin patch in Maryland and goes in the middle of the patch, and he had hollowed out a pumpkin like it was, Halloween or something. And so he lifted up the lid and he took out some microfilm. Do you know what microfilm is? Look at that now. Microfilm. All right. So in the old days when we took pictures, and you can still do this too, it makes an impression on this film, and then you get this little roll of film. So in the day, microfilm, you had your little camera, and then you could make the impressions, if you didn't print them, were on microfilm. And when I was doing research for my master's degree, we used microfilm and microfiche. Thank God you don't have to do that anymore, because if you think, yeah, allergies, it's a huge problem because all that stuff's really dusty and you have to learn how to use all these projectors and all this kind of stuff. But anyway, So it's this little strip of stuff and you pull it out and you can see like tiny pictures there. And then you can produce those and print them and then you'll get bigger pictures. And if you do photography, it's the same sort of thing as just the old kind of film. So there's a really famous picture of Nixon. I don't think it's in your book, but he's sitting in his committee and he's unreeling one of those films and looking at the pictures. And sure enough, there's a picture in there of Alger Hiss and Whittaker Chambers together at some event, and they're shaking hands or they're right next to each other. Now, I know, it doesn't mean that they knew each other, but it was enough for Congress during this era who really wanted to find people guilty rather than find them innocent, perhaps my opinion, but will be probably supported by numbers of people who lose their career and the occasional folks that we execute. So Alger Hiss ends up being convicted of perjury. They can't convict him of spying or anything more serious, but of course it ruins his career. I mean, it's a bad thing for him. All right, so House Un-American Activities Committee forces people to come testify, and if you don't name names of people, then they're going to assume that you're covering up and they'll do more of an investigation of you. This is also the era where Ronald Reagan becomes more famous because he's the head of the Screen Actors Guild, which is the big union for entertainers and writers and musicians and that sort of thing. And he got called before this committee and he's like a super patriotic dude. And he says, yeah, those guys are communists and I'll give you their names. So he becomes, this is the era where he goes from being a Democrat to a Republican because he's going to think that the Republicans are a little more serious about going after communists. Now, Truman certainly will do his part. And in this era, honestly, both parties are pretty serious about hating communists. And you really don't see that change during the Cold War until, I don't know that you see it change. You can decide that. That's up to you. All right, the McCarran Internal Security Act and the Smith Act. McCarran Internal Security Act is the one where we can kick you out of country, deny your citizenship if we think you're communist. And the Smith Act requires you to pledge a loyalty oath if you work for the government. So you have to swear allegiance to the Constitution of the United States, which I know doesn't say anything about communists because I've actually read it. It's not that long. You guys could read it. It's way shorter than your textbook. Let's see, what else do we want to say? So loyalty oaths become a thing. We're also going to add God to the Pledge of Allegiance because, evil, godless communists. So before then, we just pledged allegiance to the flag. I don't know. Do I know all the words? United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, and we add under God during this time period because we want everyone to know we love God. Yeah. And if you're wondering, do we mean we love Jesus? Mostly, but if you're Jewish, we're cool with that as well, unless you're the Rosenbergs, and then we are not cool with that because you are communist. So there you go. So we talked about Alger Hiss already, so you don't need the other story. But the Rosenbergs, oh my goodness, you could read books about the Rosenbergs. Their kids wrote a book recently, by recently, I mean within the last 10 years, talking about how their parents were set up or their parents were innocent, that sort of thing. And they wanted to try to clear their parents' names, which like for you guys, you didn't even know their parents' names were bad, did you? Yes, those rolls of film. I'm sorry, I didn't check the chat. Microfilm is the rolls of film. Microfiche is like a little square of film, and then you kind of move it around on a thing that looks like a microscope until you see the picture that you want to see. I did a lot of that back in the day. All right, but I was not a spy. I was just a graduate student. All right, Rosenberg. So the Rosenbergs, Ethel and Julius, are going to be executed for being communists. Can you imagine? For being communist spies. Now, here's how we knew they were communist spies. And they kind of sort of were communist spies, although their kids would say no. Julius, the husband, worked at Los Alamos, and he was on the Manhattan Project. So he's helping develop the nuclear weapon, atomic weapon. And so they're Russian spies. There are always spies. I mean, we had spies, they had spies, everybody's got spies. We tap each other's phones at embassies. We spy on each other. It's what we do. We still do it. We'll probably always do it. We did it back then. We we mess with each other. It's what countries do. They mess with each other. Sometimes they help each other, but they also mess with each other. So the Rosenbergs, uh, Julius works at Los Alamos. They're Russian spies who are trying to get information from Los Alamos. So they get in contact with a guy named David, let's see, David Greenglass. No, it's Klaus Fuchs. Doesn't that sound like he should be a spy? Klaus Fuchs, Fuchs. I know that sounds really bad, but Klaus Fuchs. And he is a German physicist who's emigrated to the United States along with other dudes like, I don't know, Albert Einstein, to work on this project. So yes, Fuchs. So Klaus Fuchs becomes a guy who sells stuff to the Soviet Union. But he also gets his research assistant, a guy named David Greenglass, involved, who gets his brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg. That means Ethel's David's sister. That's what that means, okay? So all these guys are involved in either stealing the stuff, making copies, and transferring those copies or delivering those copies to the Russian agents. Now, Klaus Fuchs and David Greenglass want to make some money, and the Rosenbergs think that the Soviet Union is a much better place than the United States because they think communism makes everybody more equal. Because, you know, in theory, it does. Honestly, it does, because everybody would have an equal income, equal access to healthcare, equal access to education, that sort of stuff. In theory, I'm not saying that it works in practice. I'm just, you know what I'm saying. All right. So the Rosenbergs are kind of these true believers. The other folks probably a little more motivated by profit or keeping their own secrets, which we'll talk about here in a minute. So they all get caught. So when Klaus Fuchs gets caught, they tell him like, hey, dude, we're going to execute you unless you tell us who else is involved. And he goes like, dude, David Greenglass, you go talk to him. So then David Greenglass gets questioned, and they say like, dude, we're going to recommend death penalty for you because you're a spy, treason, that sort of stuff. Unless you tell us who else was involved. He goes, man, my sister and her husband. So he turns over the Rosenbergs, and then they go like, hey, we're going to execute you unless you tell us who, and they go like, we're it. Plus, we think it was the right thing to do. And they go like, what? You think it was the right thing to do? And they go, yeah, we think it was the right thing to do. So their trial continues, and they get convicted of selling nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union. Now, here's an issue. It's the 50s. It's right after the Holocaust, and these guys are Jewish. Do we want to, and also in the 50s, we kind of have this resurgence of how important moms and kids are. So do we want to execute two Jewish folks, one of them a mom of two kids under the age of 10? Do we want to execute these folks in the 50s when we're, right after World War II, and when we think the nuclear family is the greatest thing? By nuclear, we don't mean explosive, we mean nucleus of mom, dad, and kids. That's what we mean. So that, yes, communism is evil and godless. It is true. This is sort of Salem witch trials, but on a much more, it's honestly a much bigger scale. I know you're not the class that took me for 1301, but you know the Salem witch trials, again, not a good thing, but 19 people in a very isolated part of a very small state that whole state thought Salem was out of its mind. There's no one else that supported the Salem witch trials in the United States. And that was in an era where witch trials were really prominent. We looked up, like 50,000 witches were killed in Europe. So for whatever reason, I'm not saying, again, not saying killing someone because you think they might be a witch is ever a good idea. And I'm also not suggesting that killing 19 people is okay because it's only 19. But I think in our minds, it's a whole bunch of people. Part of the reason you know so much about the Salem witch trials is most of the literature written about the Salem witch trials is written, guess when? During the time period we're talking about. because they can't complain about the government being repressive or oppressive to people who might have had some socialist or communist leanings, because nobody wants to lose their job and their career or perhaps their lives like the Rosenbergs. So rather than getting blacklisted, losing their careers, they're going to write a whole bunch of stuff about Puritans who probably aren't nearly as bad as we were in the 1950s. But anyway, that's my little, we overstated the Salem witch trials speech. But the reason we overstated it is because it's much safer to write about the Salem witch trials than it is to complain about Richard Nixon or to complain about Joseph McCarthy. See what I'm saying? But anyway, all right. So the Rosenbergs, they get a deal. The federal government says, all right, we're going to give you a deal. You'll just renounce communism. We will get rid of the death penalty. And they go like, no, why would we renounce communism? We love it. And it's like, okay, then. So they get executed. Yeah. Yeah. And if you watch I don't know why you would, but if you watch the newsreels where, I can't remember if it's in Leavenworth where this happens, but it's some federal penitentiary. You know how the death penalty during that time period was probably the electric chair. It was for these two. The electric chair doesn't always work the first time. So Ethel, yeah, she didn't absorb electricity quite as well as Julius. So they talked about how it took a couple of tries. Yeah, it's pretty gruesome stuff. But yeah, so we execute the Rosenbergs. And honestly, during the era, it's, we will decide later on that it's a violation of the Eighth Amendment because it doesn't work all the time. Yep, no, that's exactly right. And it's part of why lots of states are getting rid of the death penalty, even in the modern era. And honestly, most states don't use it very often. I'm not saying anything at all, good, bad, or indifferent, because I know everybody has different opinions on it. But it's that Eighth Amendment thing that is pushing states away from it because, yeah, the method doesn't always work. All right, Senator McCarthy, Joseph McCarthy, who is the junior senator from Wisconsin, doesn't mean that he's young. It means he's been in office less than the other senator. So I'm trying to think. In our state, we have Ted Cruz and John Cornyn. And John Cornyn's the senior senator, not because he's older, but because he's been there longer. He is older, by the way. But McCarthy's becomes a senator in Wisconsin, and McCarthy wants to make a name for himself. So, and the book talks about this in that section that I ask you to read, 926 to 940. He wants to make a name for himself, and the way to do it during this time period is to get in on the accusing people of being communist stuff. Hence why we call it McCarthyism, because apparently he's quite successful at this. So he starts accusing people of being communist. At first, he does it at local Chamber of Commerce luncheons or Elks Club or whatever. And he'll hold up a list and he'll say, here in my hand, I have a list of 82 suspected communists who work in the government, usually the State Department. So, because that was easy. Because the State Department people are kind of nameless bureaucrats and, we don't see them very often. And he's not accusing the Secretary of State or anything. Well, that's not true. He actually does at some point, which is fun. I mean, it's not funny, but he accuses, let's see, it was George Marshall. He accuses George Marshall of the Marshall Plan. He had been a general in the U.S. Army. And he was friends with the president, who was Eisenhower at that point. And Eisenhower's like, we got to take him down, but we got to do it privately. We can't do it publicly. So he does get taken down privately. But, they wouldn't even speak out against him because they didn't want to appear to be anti-communist and they didn't want to shake any political waves. So McCarthy has, at first a blank piece of paper that he says is a list, and then he gets a committee and he gets hearings and televised eventually. So he accuses all kinds of folks of being communist. And he usually starts with State Department employees, and people just go like, yeah, that's interesting. But then he starts accusing people in the military. Now, I don't know if you know people from the military, but in this era, the most unpatriotic thing the public could consider you being during this era was communist. So if you have friends, relatives, no acquaintances that have been in the military and you go like, you know what, I question your patriotism. Is this a good idea? Do you know any military people that go like, yeah, dude, go ahead, question my patriotism? Because I don't know very many people who feel like that. They usually get a little upset when you do that. And then you're going to find out what military skills that they developed while they were in the military. So when McCarthy starts to accuse the military, that's kind of the beginning of the end for him. So they make sure they hire the best lawyer they can find, a guy named, what was his name? It is Joseph as well. Why can't I think of the name? Oh, I'm going to have to look it up because it'll bother me. But they hire a really good attorney from the time period. Dang, phone. Crud, it bugs me that I can't remember. And they make sure that the hearings are televised so that McCarthy looks stupid on TV. Mm. Oh, gosh. I misspelled that so badly it didn't even show up. Welch, that's his name. I didn't get to look it up, but I know that's it, Joseph Welch. But anyway, all right. So on television, McCarthy is like he's too loud, he's hitting his podium, he's slurring his speech, and then people start to think something's up with McCarthy. So stories start to circulate that maybe McCarthy's got just a teeny weeny bit of a drinking problem, mostly because he probably had a drinking problem. And so he starts to look like he's out of control. He becomes really disgraced. Now, people also start talking about him. It's like, there's something wrong with McCarthy because not only does he seem like he might be drunk, he's kind of old. And you know what he's not? Married. He's not married. So, what could that possibly mean if you're kind of old and you're not married? There's only one thing that means: you're gay. That's, well, yeah, you might die alone too. But in the 50s, there are some things that you just didn't want to be because it just wasn't cool for you culturally. One of those would be gay. The other one of those things would be addicted to something. Here, now we have speculation that McCarthy is 2 for 2, that he's both gay and addicted to something. And if you're wondering, does that matter? Oddly enough, in this era, it kind of does, because here's kind of the common thought during this era. The best way the evil, godless communists of the Soviet Union could get you to be a spy was to find out whatever your secret was, and then they would use that to blackmail you. It's like, you're going to spy for us because we know that you drink too much. And if people find out you're an alcoholic, that will shame your family. Or if people find out you're gay, that will shame your family and it will ruin your career. And what if you're a gay alcoholic? Man, that's like 2 for 2. I know, it's the worst in the 50s. It really is. So people start suggesting that maybe that's what's going on. So then McCarthy runs out and gets married really fast. He marries somebody about half his age who'd been a beauty queen, who also might have been an intern in his office. And of course, the goal is to have a baby really quickly because that will show, well, it's a long time ago. Okay. Like in some families, I'm trying to think what would shame my family. Not that I'm going to try to do that. Honestly, I'll say it out loud. We're friends now. In my family, if you're too liberal, that's not cool. Yeah. Yeah. In other families, I'm trying to think what my husband's family, oh, yeah, well, he's deceased and his family's not on the call. So in my husband's family, if you get a secret, yeah, for some of you, grades, that is true. When I was a little kid, if you embarrassed your mom in public, that was bad. But yeah, in the 50s, family shame, pretty much anything that didn't seem normal. The 50s, I've already mentioned it's a really good time for economics, and apparently my dad thought for cars. But if you don't fit the norm, it is a rough time. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about the next chapter a little bit. But it's a weird time where everybody's got to fit in. I would always tell my high school students when I just taught high school, I mean not just, but I mean only. I don't mean like it's a shame. Teaching high school is a lovely job. But that it was like the entire country was a giant middle school. And if you didn't fit in, people talked about you and it was embarrassing and all that kind of stuff. There's a movie called Pleasantville. It's a really older movie. And if you watch that, it really kind of gives you the feeling of the 50s, I think, in a good way. It's not terribly accurate historically, but it is kind of interesting. I know you guys have a lot of free time to watch old movies. Yeah, yeah, and it's funny because there are many things about my family that I don't think they realize don't really fit into being conservative in a lot of ways, but in their minds, yeah. And for whatever reason, for my generation, going to college made you a liberal. Now, my niece and nephew generation, who those guys are a little older than you, it was sort of expected that they would all go to college or a trade school because here's another thing that happens sometimes when you go to college, you make more money and nobody seems to object to that. So so that next generation, they all went to college and nobody thinks they're liberal. They just think, oh, they have better jobs, which is also true. Yeah, I don't know. Pleasantville. It really is an interesting movie. Yeah, I think so too. All right, but it's that, and we still have that stigma of not fitting in. It's just, what doesn't fit in now is probably different by community or family or that kind of thing. I know when I taught, again, public school, mostly high school, I taught middle school a little bit. It was the lunchroom is where you really saw it in the old days, where everybody went and sat with whatever their group was. And I don't think that kids necessarily shunned the other groups, but you could definitely see that people gravitated to their own group, whatever it was. In middle school, they really did shun the other groups. But anyway, I'm going to get the 3-minute warning soon, so I better get back to finishing this. So McCarthy, after all this stuff comes out, McCarthy gets married, tries to have a baby really fast. They can't have a baby, so they adopt. And then people go like, oh, see, he really is gay. I don't know why yeah, anyway, I do kind of know, but it seems stupid. So then when all this happens, the Army McCarthy hearings finish, he gets censured and shunned, and then he just dies. Yeah, some sort of liver ailment, and then people go like, see, and yeah, there you go, the end of McCarthy. Now, does that mean now it's okay if you're communist? No, it's just not cool to be McCarthy. Oh my goodness. And also, I know I've already talked to you about this. If you're in any way different, challenging the status quo, people think you're unpatriotic, you're trying to bring the country down, and you might be a spy. So it wasn't uncommon for people to think that Martin Luther King Jr. was, a communist. Yeah, I know. It's a weird time period. But I think I made it. I was a little nervous that I wasn't going to. Let's see, what else do we want to talk about? The weekly question, I promise you, if you go, you know what to do. Weekly question. I'm not going to say it again. Um, but the not fitting in thing is a problem, and anything in this time period that either made you different or made you seem critical of the United States. So leaders who really pushed for change sometimes got branded communist, which might mean that it harms their career, their family, their ability to make money, that kind of stuff. It's what happened to that Paul Robeson fellow that we may have talked about in the 20s, the guy who was the lawyer, football player, singer, actor kind of guy who demanded that if he was going to give a concert that the audience would be integrated, and he's really the only entertainer of that era that got that. But eventually he'll work with labor unions to try to get them more rights. And then after the Cold War is branded a communist, and his passport's taken away. At that point, he was making more money overseas than he was in the United States. So that ends up being a problem. Also during this era, you'll see a much stronger Pan-African movement. So you'll see some of the more, I would say, radical civil rights leaders spending much more more time out of the country and going back to different countries in Africa and having Pan-African conference meetings and that sort of stuff. So it's an unusual time period. And that's why I know I've mentioned to you, my father thinks it was probably the best time of his life, again, probably because of the cars and stuff. But it also is pretty much a signal that one, he's not being completely honest, because I, as I've gotten older, learned some more details about his life in the 50s, and it was not ideal. And two, it's also, you won't meet too many people of color who lived during this time period who will say, no, that was the best time of my life. They won't. My husband's father never said that, never did. He talked about civil rights violations and being parts of court cases and desegregating schools and that sort of stuff. So, context, right? But the 50s on the surface, really idyllic. And it goes along with that movie, Pleasantville. Everything on the surface looks good, but beneath the surface, it doesn't. I would argue with you that it's sort of like, if you guys look at each other's social media, I don't know, because I'm old, so I don't have same social media as you guys do, but Instagram, or I don't know, Snapchat. Do you people do that? I don't know. But whatever you guys do, you post pictures, and I affiliate sometimes with younger people, and I'll notice they don't take a picture, they take about 15 or 20 pictures, and then they pick the one they like the best, and then they add a filter, and then they edit it. It's like, you don't really want people to know what you really look like, but people post the stuff that they think portrays them in the best light. So you can look at somebody else's social media and go like, man, that looks perfect. The 50s, it's like all of society was kind of like that. We wanted everything to look perfect. And if it wasn't perfect beneath the surface, our goal was to hide that, because we needed to keep our secret. And that made you potentially vulnerable to becoming an evil, godless communist spy or something. At least that was kind of the weird thought of the era. And if you're wondering, like, were there people who were just pretty open about their differences? Yeah, there's like 5. There aren't very many. And this is where I know it's almost time for the 3-minute warning. I will also encourage you, if you're thinking book review and you haven't picked a book yet, you haven't picked a subject, one of my favorite people from this era is a guy named Bayard Rustin. I'll type his name in there. And thank you. He is a fascinating dude, I think. I'm trying to type his name in there, but it didn't work well. So if you're looking for a subject for book review, and it's like, I don't know, to give me something interesting, Bayard Rustin is a fascinating dude. He is going to be the guy that kind of leads the nonviolent civil rights training. So he's pretty well schooled in Gandhi and Jesus, of course, definitely a nonviolent guy, not necessarily a civil rights guy, but certainly a nonviolent guy. And you would go to summer camp with Bayard Rustin, where he would teach you like how to curl up into a ball. You guys would practice getting screamed at and not screaming back, that sort of stuff. But he's really kind of the guru and the organizer of the civil rights movement. He's also an openly gay Black man in the 1950s. So he's never the public leader of anything. He's the guy who organizes the March on Washington, where you have the I Have a Dream speech. He sets up all the speakers to culminate with Martin Luther King Jr. He affiliates with Martin Luther King Jr. all the time and helps him organize stuff and trains the people who protest, that kind of stuff. You read about Strom Thurmond, that's a weird dude as well. They probably didn't hang out, Strom Thurmond and Bayard Rustin. And they both had secrets, just different secrets. But Bayard Rustin, I think when they made the book into the movie, they called him Brother Outsider. But I mean, he was openly gay and knew that that was going to keep him from being a recognized figure in the civil rights movement. And civil rights leaders made sure that he wasn't a recognized leader of the civil rights movement, because that would bring dispute to him. Okay. You guys are funny. All right, but I think he is a fascinating guy. There's so many fascinating people in history, I think, and so many more than just the mainstream ones, although the mainstream ones I think are fascinating too. So, all right, you guys are funny now. All right, I'm going to stop the recording. I know I